Welcome back, everybody, to 360 Sports Network at 360sportsnetwork.com. I am the Lost Cause, coming to you again with the Pigskin Blink, a daily look at fantasy football and the NFL and everything in between to make your fantasy football team hum. Let's look at some of the big games yesterday as Denver comes into Minnesota and pulls out a win, 35-32 on what was not really a lot of the running game as far as Tim Tebow went. Only 13 yards on the ground, but he did it in the air. 10 of 15 for 202, 2 touchdowns and no interceptions. McGahee 111 on the ground, 1 touchdown. Demaryius Thomas, 4 receptions out of 7 targets for 144 and 2 touchdowns. Decker 2 of 4 for 25 yards. These receivers, if they get a little bit more consistent with their catching, with the amount of targets that they're seeing, these fantasy totals are going to go through the roof, because 144, it's not a bad thing. Decker last week, 50%, had 90 plus. There's going to be a lot of fantasy points to go around on that offense if they keep Tim Tebow stabilized, a 149 quarterback ranking. Now this week I said Tim Tebow, I didn't think that he'd get anything on the run. I responded to a comment within the 360 Sports Network blog about Tim Tebow and his chances in Minnesota. I didn't think that he'd get a lot on the ground, but I thought that if he was going to get anything, he'd get it through the air, and sure enough, he put together a solid performance, about 20 points, depending on the league that you play in. On the other side of the ball, Ponder, 381, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. That's an awful lot of points, especially if you get bonuses for going over a certain amount of yardage. On the ground, Gerhardt, 21 of 94, 4.3 average, also catching 42 yards in the air, 8 receptions on 8 targets. If you play in PPR, Gerhardt with Adrian Peterson being down a lot more often than not at this point for the rest of the season, I think that he becomes an option. Percy Harvin, the big receiver, 8 of 9, 156, 2 touchdowns, not dealing with too many migraines right now, had a big play kind of a day, also 5 carries for 19 yards. Minnesota and Denver are very, very odd teams when it comes to their NFL their NFL rating as opposed to their fantasy rating. I think there's a lot of fantasy value when you look through the teams, but it's a very inconsistent kind of a thing. The running game, yes, Gerhardt, he's going to be solid for the rest of the year. He's not going to be fantastic like AP is. McGahee, he's going to be solid through the year. He's not going to be an absolute mind-blowing, Chris Johnson, Beanie Wells kind of performance in his last 2 weeks, but they will get you solid points. Elsewhere, the Colts, trying to get their first win of the season against a very hot New England team, but fall to them 21-31 on Dan Orlowski's first performance of the year, which wasn't that bad as far as fantasy football goes, and isn't that bad as far as the NFL goes. 30-37, 353, a 9.5-yard average. Finishes the game with an NFL quarterback rating of 113, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. That's a pretty good amount. I mean, you're looking at between 22 and 24 points right there, depending on the league that you play in. Donald Brown, 14 carries, 41 yards, 1 touchdown. Yes, only 2.9 yards per average, but really a lot of these running backs didn't. Delone Carter, 3 carries, 20 yards, a 6-yard average. Joseph Adai, 13 of 39, 3-yard average. So it was kind of in that place, but right now I think Donald Brown is the feature back, even though it's a 3-headed giant right now. He is going to be the feature back. Pierre Garçon, 9 out of 12 targets, almost the 10 reception game, which everybody kind of looks for, 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. Cauley, 70 yards, Reggie Wayne, 55 yards, and Tammy, 49 yards in the air. On the opposite side of the ball, Tom Brady, 29 of 38 for 289, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, finishes the game with a 114 quarterback rating. On the ground, not too much. The law firm Green Ellis having the only touchdown on the game besides a Gronkowski touchdown on the ground. That's right. 1 carry for 2 yards. He gets in the air, 2 touchdowns caught, 64 yards. Wes Walker also an 11 reception game for 110 yards. Hernandez, Branch, each having a little bit of yardage. I think as far as Indianapolis goes, I think that Orlowski, he could develop into something. I wouldn't rush out to get him. It's just like I had said earlier in the week, and we even discussed on the toolkit, he's not going to be somebody that you're going to rush out and get. However, if you do want to pick up somebody that has some upside, especially in that offense with the targets that he has and what they can develop into, I think Orlowski might be a pickup. Looking into Tampa Bay, Carolina Panthers come in and double up the score on Tampa Bay, 38-19 on the back of the Cam Newton show. Cam Newton passing is pretty effective. A 106 quarterback ranking. As far as fantasy football goes with his passing, not so much. 204 yards and 1 touchdown. However, what he lacks on the arm, he makes up for in the legs. 54 yards on the ground and 3 touchdowns. This was a monster fantasy football day for Cam Newton owners. Jonathan Stewart also getting in the scoring, 80 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground. Yesterday I mentioned Brandon LaFell. He was the big receiver for Carolina yesterday as he gets 64 yards, but he doesn't find the end zone. Naney, 38 yards and 1 touchdown in the air. Smith, Newton, Shockey, they each had a few, only about 20 yards receiving, but that's also the odd thing. Cam Newton also had 27 yards receiving and was 4th on the team in receiving. So basically, he's the tri-threat right now, and all those owners that were laughing at people picking up Cam Newton in the draft right now are probably bawling their eyes out. Josh Johnson gets a start for Tampa. Really doesn't put up any impressive numbers, NFL or fantasy-wise. 16 for 27, 229, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. On the ground, he gets 45 yards. Not really a lot of rushing going on, even from Blunt. A 1.7 average, 11 of 19. Not really that good. No receptions. Definitely wasn't as solid as a fantasy play as I thought he was. Mike Williams puts out 93 yards. 9 points is better than none at this point for him. And Ben and Winslow both finish with 40-plus yards. A huge scoring game in the NFL went on yesterday. Almost went into overtime. I thought that it was. My son's a Green Bay fan. We were both going back and forth, especially in the last 2 minutes. But Green Bay pulls it out, 38-35 over the Giants. Now, that being said, the Giants, even though that they lost, there were massive fantasy points all over the place. We're going to cover everybody here. Aaron Rodgers, 4 touchdowns, 369 yards, 1 interception, yes, but the 32 yards on the ground definitely make up for that interception as he finishes the game with somewhere in the neighborhood of 32, 34 points, possibly, somewhere around there. On the ground, Aaron Rodgers was the top rusher for the Green Bay Packers with 32 yards. Ryan Grant, 29. Sane, 16. Now, Sane is slowly going to develop, and I said this before. He's a sleeper. Brandon Sane is going to develop as a pretty strong running back for the Packers. I mean, you saw it in the times that he was getting the ball, and he's also a receiving back. 4 receptions for 29 yards. You don't got to run out and get him, but I'm telling you, you keep your eye on this guy. Greg Jennings, 7 receptions off of 14 targets. You need to get up that catch percentage there, buddy. 94 yards, 1 touchdown. Jordy Nelson, a huge catch late in the game. 4 receptions out of 4 targets, 94 yards. No touchdowns, unfortunately. Finley, 6 of 11. 87 yards, 1 touchdown, and Donald Driver's snapback game, 4 receptions out of 4 targets, 34 yards, and 2 touchdowns. On the other side of the ball, Eli Manning still having a solid fantasy football year, finishing the game with a 100 quarterback rating, 347 yards off of 23 completions, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception. Running backs, Brandon Jacobs definitely getting the job done. 8 carries, 59 yards, 1 touchdown. Looking at the receivers, there was just so many receiving numbers. You could have just thrown in just about anybody. I'll put it to you this way. Jake Ballard, he was the worst of the best. 3 receptions for 47 yards, going right back up. Beckham, 1 reception for 67 yards, 1 touchdown. Hakeem Nicks, 7 receptions out of 12 targets, 88 yards, 2 touchdowns. And big Victor Cruz, 7-9 for 119, but no touchdowns. The final big game that we're going to take a look at is the Detroit Lions visiting the New Orleans Saints. Detroit Lions going down 17-31. Matt Stafford, 400 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, finishing with a 97 quarterback rating. On the ground, Kevin Smith gets the start, 6 carries, 34 yards, 1 touchdown. Maurice Morris, 12 carries for 28 yards. In the air, though, 5 receptions for 47 yards and 1 touchdown. Nate Burleson, the big receiver for Detroit, 5 receptions out of 8 targets for 93 yards, no touchdowns. Johnson, 6 receptions out of 8 targets for 69 yards. And Young, Titus Young, we mentioned a couple weeks ago, 2 receptions out of 2 targets for 60 yards, but no touchdowns. On the other side of the ball, New Orleans, big Drew Brees, constant play every week, people. 26 for 36, 342, 3 touchdowns, and no, count them, no interceptions. Mark Ingram, we mentioned the 3-headed giant before. Seems like he's starting to emerge slowly but surely. 16 carries, 54 yards, 1 touchdown. Only a 3.4 average, but he gets the job done. In the air, no receptions for him. That is of concern. Darren Sproles, 4 carries for 28 yards on the ground. However, in the air, 5 receptions, 46 yards, and 1 touchdown. Robert Meacham was the big receiver for New Orleans yesterday. 3 receptions out of 6 targets, 119, 1 touchdown. Graham doesn't find the end zone, but does find a lot of steady yardage. 8 receptions out of 10 targets for 89 yards. Colston, 54 yards, and Lance Moore finishes up the receiving pack, 23 yards off of 2 receptions for 1 touchdown. Other big names to keep an eye out for, to keep looking out for. Ray Rice, of course, solid start this past game, 204 yards on the ground, 1 touchdown. Chris Johnson, 153 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, an average of 6.7 for him, as well as Marshawn Lynch, which the game was played Thursday, 148, 2 touchdowns. Willis McGahee, as mentioned before, 111, 1 touchdown. And, of course, Arian Foster, 111 and 1 touchdown. For the receiving leaders, really everyone was mentioned. Every big-name receiver was mentioned in these games. Percy Harvin coming out on top of all the receivers with 156 and 2 touchdowns. Pierre Garçon, 150 for 2 touchdowns. And Demaryius Thomas, 144 for 2 touchdowns. You can check out this broadcast as well as every other broadcast of the Daily Pigskin Blink at 360sportsnetwork.com. You can also check out fantasyfootballtoolkit.com's iTunes store for your daily recap, your daily preview, review, stats, rumors, and everything else that the Daily Pigskin Blink can give you to make your fantasy football team hum. Will be on the iTunes store. You can also check out tomorrow's broadcast of the Fantasy Football Toolkit as I and Greg answer your questions, sit starts, also a look ahead to this week's games, this week's matchups, and exactly what you should do to get your team geared for the playoffs. You can follow 360 Sports at Twitter at 3S Network. You can also email questions, comments, suggestions, everything else for the 360 Sports Network to 360sportsnetwork at gmail.com. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions for me, you can email me at lostcause at Fantasy Football Toolkit. That's it for me, everybody. Have a great one.